Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, joined by my friend, colleague, compatriot, partner in crime, Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, before we went on the air, we were kind of talking about how nothing's been going on. It's been a really slow few days for both of us. Pretty boring, nothing extraordinary happening, which is really weird. I don't know. That just doesn't seem right to me. Maybe that's not what we were talking about.
Indeed, that's not what I remember. And this prompts me to see this for the second time, a French phrase, au contraire. To the contrary, as they say. We're kind of joking there because actually sometimes when Nathan and I catch up before we go on the air, it's just a parade of insane synchronicities and trying to make sense of what's going on in our lives and what's happening in our world. And sometimes on the show, you only get to hear part of it just because, some of it's sensitive, some of it's personal, but I think we're going to roll out more and more as time goes on. But as I've kind of been hinting for a long time, there's things going on in the deepest trenches of reality, I would suggest, in addition to us just sort of talking about these topics in a kind of academic way. So one of the things we try to do on this show is tread that line, right, between the metaphysical implications of what's actually happening in our reality and trying to, with some sort of academic, perspective, talk about these things as well, so that we don't get caught up in a particular thing. But we can't deny the fact that things really are happening in our reality, and that's probably the most compelling aspect of all.
Yeah, I'm so glad you talked about that, because it is important that we bring our whole personhood into the conversation. It's not just an academic, as you said, exercise or at arm's length with this content and theories. It does intersect with who we are and what we are experiencing in our day-to-day lives, and sometimes in very profound and kind of world-shattering types of ways. So it's important to kind of wrestle through that and tease out the underlying threads and maybe the bigger picture at play. And that's something that we want to spend some time on the episode this evening. And that's talking through these kinds of we minds, we spaces, how that works, does it work, and how that might be different from our modern conception of consciousness, where it's sort of situated just inside your brain, and there's nothing magical or different or crazy that happens when you gather with another person and you have a conversation. It's just two minds, sort of housed within their skulls having a conversation. And we want to kind of explore that and ask, is that really all that's happening? And what kinds of things are created from this interplay of conscious entities? And so, I don't know, Darren, where do you want to begin with this and kind of thinking through this we space, we mind concept?
Well, I think about some of our discussions around Donald Hoffman's work, and he talks about this sense that you have an individual conscious agent, which on the one hand you could, really reduce that down to, an atom or a quark, something really, really tiny, microscopic, or just an individual like you or I, right, that we are a conscious agent. But what he also points out is that even mathematically it works in his model that when you and I are talking together, right, and we represent the spirit, if you will, of liminal frames, that becomes its own kind of conscious agent, which is more than the sum of its parts. It kind of takes on a life of its own, right? And that's a lot of what we'll talk about tonight in terms of tulpas and egregores and these different notions that have existed in ancient, like, Buddhist traditions and more recently in theosophy and things. This sense that it's not this cold, detached thing like we've been presented in physicalism, that really when consciousness intersects and interacts, so these different conscious agents, that produces something that can sometimes take on a life of its own. So one of the things we'll tackle tonight is several different sort of areas and genres of human history and groups that have existed, but how each of them kind of demonstrate this alchemical kind of process, right, where consciousness joins together and becomes a thing of its own, sometimes for good, sometimes maybe not so for good, but nevertheless it seems to happen. And it's interesting how it's not just something that we hear about in like the occultic kind of traditions and whatnot, but also, like I say, even in modern conceptions of reality that someone like Donald Hoffman puts forward as an actual model that can be tested scientifically in the long run.
Yes. Well, let's start with some notions around this that we are familiar with in our own experience, both as individuals, but also in our academic training. And that's looking at some examples of group mind and group thinking in history. So here I'm speaking specifically to religious rituals that are made a part of everyone's not everyone, but many people who practice a particular religious system. They're very familiar with what these things look like. In Christianity, the tradition that I grew up in, there are several rituals that I think even if you weren't a Christian, you'll be a little bit familiar with. So things like going to church every Sunday and singing songs together and participating in what's called the Eucharist or communion. Saying prayers that also follow a kind of formulaic style, and that varies, of course, by the congregation or community of believers. There's a kind of unique imprint or formula that each community follows, and so that it's a way of signaling that you're in the community and maybe out of the community. Reading the text itself and reading it in a certain way, believing that reading the text has a sort of higher level meaning, not just on face value, but there are multiple layers of meaning at work in that process of reading and listening to that material. So all of these different practices are not practiced in isolation, although sometimes they are, but often, or most often, they're practiced in a community. And it's that community of practitioners that over time becomes, as we said just a minute ago, becomes something of its own, that it takes on a life of its own, identity of its own. People, if you're in a community, like a small town, you might know, oh, I know those people down, at such and such Methodist or whatever, they're like this, and hopefully it's, generally good. Although if you're Baptist, sometimes there's like this war between, well, the Methodists are like this and the Baptists are like this. But there's an identity that basically is created there. And I think not only is that present in church history, but we can talk a little bit later too about how it's present in all these different facets of our own modern life that aren't just centered around religious belief. And it's funny, we've gotten really accustomed to sort of boxing religion to this sort of separate kind of corner and saying, well, I don't do religion anymore. I'm a modernist. I'm a rationalist. I don't think I don't have beliefs. I just, I live in reality, man. Well, we got news for you. So anyway, those are some, some things that I think about in terms of how we space is created and crafted through shared practices. But Darren, what are some examples from your own experience, and how do you think about those things?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, it's building on what you were just saying there. These begin as things that are generated, but then they become generative in themselves, right? Right. That's what we mean by taking on a life of their own. And you make a really good point there that, sometimes modern people will think that we're done with that kind of aspect of our history, and we're now objective, right? And detached and kind of, not swayed by those things that we used to be, and therefore not even believing that these things could have a life of their own. And of course, that strong belief in that is something that has taken on a life of its own, so much so that you become blind to it, right? That's part of the irony here. But in terms of Christian history and how that even relates to more modern findings in physics and whatnot, something I find really interesting is, I remember this one time I went into I was in Germany for a while. So after I graduated high school, I went to Europe for a while and actually spent some time staying with a friend who had actually been in an exchange program when I was in high school. So I went and stayed with him in Germany, and he came and stayed with my family. And when I was there in Germany, it was very interesting because it's a very post-Christian society there, much more than the United States, right? So, but what's funny is you'll still have, like, I think one of the political parties, I think, might have even been called the Christian Democrats, right? but that wasn't what it sounds like, right? Like that's kind of, again, the historical underpinning, but that's not really what they're at now. And he was a committed atheist, but he took me into the Catholic Church, somewhere in Mainz, Germany, I think it was where we were. Yeah. And, he did the whole like holy water thing before he walked in. And I could tell he was like eyeing me like, you're going to do the right ritual, right? Like, you're not going to embarrass me. And I said to him afterwards, but Franz, you told me you're an atheist. He's like, well, yeah. I'm like, so why do you even care about all these, like, these rituals? He's like, well, because, this is just what we do. And so he was still attached to rituals, even though he'd ripped out the underlying meaning. But that also reminded me of this one time I heard this dialogue between kind of a physicalist, right? Someone who reduces all of reality to basically these physical properties that can be measured, right? In the sense that these measurements actually represent reality, which is quite preposterous. And, our philosopher friend Bernardo Kastrup has talked about that a lot. But I remember this one time I saw this program where this person who was actually spiritual and had religious belief was talking to like a detective that was basically, a physicalist. And they're like, so tell me about this water here. And he's like, well, it's holy water. And he's like, right, but it's just water, right? And then the guy's like, well, I don't know how to answer that question, because basically they were coming in from two completely different paradigms, right? They had no way to sync up in the middle. And what's interesting is, again, to a modern person, they might say, yeah, that person who had religious belief is believing silly things, right? And we're done with that kind of medieval silliness. But what's very interesting is they've done studies, experiments recently, where they will actually have people send positive intention or pray over like a single cell or an amoeba or even water, right? Send positive intention into water and then use that water to water certain plants, and use another set of water that people actually send all sorts of kind of negative energy into, anger, fear, right? And actually they concentrated this into the water and then use that to water other plants. And there was a demonstrable difference in the growth of those plants. And this is like scientifically done, right? This is like rigorous protocols. This works. This happens, right? So this is refuting this kind of hardline physicalism that says these things aren't possible and that consciousness alone can't impact our physical reality. So I just thought it was interesting reflecting on all of those aspects when you brought that up.
Yeah, and well, the work there I'm thinking of is the work from Bill Bingston as well. Kind of that same kind of intention and healing and healing at a distance. So certainly related areas of inquiry that have been studied very vigorously. And also I think too here of growing up, and I'm sure you have some examples with this as well, of how it sometimes doesn't work. We kind of in religious communities, we sometimes can get really wrapped up in the power of prayer and talk about, well, if we just all pray together and focus our minds in the same direction, well, we're going to something miraculous will happen. It's just like that's just how this works. And
the size of a mustard seed can move a mountain, right?
Exactly, brother. So there's a lot of examples like that, but it doesn't always work, right? So then that's where the skeptic or the jaded believer will kind of have a moment where they're like, I don't believe in this anymore. I can remember growing up, there was a young woman in our youth group. She was in a tragic, like a really severe car accident, was rushed to the hospital. The whole youth group was praying for her, and she didn't make it, and I can only imagine like kind of how that affected others in the group in terms of whether they decided to remain believers or not. And of course, the church community itself wrestled with that for a very long time. And so I bring that up to say that it's funny how we apply kind of a scientific framework in those examples to that practice, thinking, well, if I just put in these inputs, I will get these outputs. And you're not seeing that happen. At least you're not seeing that happen reliably. But that's not reason necessarily to say, well, it doesn't work or there isn't any truth to that. It just means that there is a more complex or mysterious or dynamic interaction that is taking place that doesn't conform to our pure intention. And that's a critique that you hear a lot from folks that aren't into idealism that, well, if idealism, all the idealists think that they can just, change the world just by thinking about it. And, we've touched on that critique before. And I think it, on face, it seems like a very valid one. But really, when you kind of explore the ways in which reality is stitched together with all of these different conscious agents and conscious agent activity, it makes sense that it wouldn't be just as simple as, well, I want to think this, and therefore, reality itself is changed at a fundamental level. So I don't know what like, how do you think in terms of putting these things together, putting them in practice? How does it transform reality? What are the limitations of it? What are some other manifestations of this kind of practice that we see in the world around us?
Yeah, and I was thinking when you were describing there the people's critique of this kind of idealistic perspective, but really, as you and I both know, what they're describing is kind of solipsism, right? The sense that all that really is your own consciousness. And if that were the case, then sure, you can shape reality to whatever your whims are. But what we're actually seeing is an idealism. We are in kind of a dreamscape, but it's held in mind at large, to use Bernardo's language again. So we are kind of characters within the dream that are also ultimately iterations of source, but we're also characters in the dream. So we don't have, just like a character in a play, they can't go and rip up the set, right? I mean, it doesn't work that way. So there's some cohesion to the entire stage play. But to your other point about, we can't apply this sort of scientific, formulaic, reproducible kind of expectation, right? Oh, so we found out that faith of a mustard seed moves mountains. So, anybody, regardless of who they are and their background and how, consciously developed they are or not, should be able to apply this principle. We should see a result. We don't, it doesn't work, right? But of course, the added factor that needs to be taken into consideration there is the level of consciousness brought to bear on that. That is one of the factors. So we, as of yet, have no scientific way of testing that, other than there's some very interesting studies that have been done. Well, they'll take people who've meditated for 30, 40 years, right? And they'll actually study how their brains actually operate compared to someone who doesn't. And they're very, very different. So we do see examples where conscious intention and conscious practice over time, like with methods like meditation, really do change things. And actually that these people seem to begin to interact with reality differently, right? So this is very interesting. And this is what I would say here, is that even what we see with the others, right, the aliens or the interdimensionals or whatever you want to call them, the different sets of others that are part of this grand cosmic mystery, they seem to have a different relationship with reality itself. And as we've said many times, when these changes happen, it's not just that you see the world differently. The world you see is different. The world you interact with is different. Your fundamental relationship with reality is different, because if consciousness is primary, then as your consciousness grows and sort of passes this threshold, then suddenly you're able to, through things like thought forms, actually manipulate what we perceive as physical reality, right, directly. And I really want to hit on that, the significance, the emphasis being on what we perceive as physical reality. Because again, the whole point with idealism is that underlyingly everything is consciousness. There is no table and a Nathan. It's all consciousness, right? They take different forms. They have kind of different vibrational kind of signatures, but ultimately it's all consciousness. So that being the case, it should not surprise us as we increase our consciousness capacities, we will fundamentally change our relationship with physical reality, because physical reality ultimately is just a derivative state of something that ultimately is consciousness.
Yeah, and how does this come into play with things like sort of society level behavior or culture? I think it very well does, right? So you can look through history at different cultures and their different belief systems. Their cultures became sort of mirrors of those individual belief systems or smaller group belief systems, and we see a movement of change over time as well. throughout history that there was a time in human history where there were a lot of empires, and there was a lot of kind of warring and tribalism there. Obviously, there's still a lot of that happening now, but we have the added component of globalism and market economies and corporatism. We've got things as recently as the Citizens United Supreme Court case, which basically gives kind of a level of personhood to corporations. So we have different manifestations of group thinking, of group identities over time. Do these concepts, do they exist in sort of other cultures than just kind of the Western way of thinking? I know we've talked about before, like in Buddhism, for example, this notion of the tulpa. Maybe you want to unpack that definition, and how does that conception influence what we think about in this conversation?
Right. One of the aspects that I've discussed with you a lot at length is the overlap between and the synergy between notions like idealism as a metaphysical model, and then Vedantic and even Neo-Vedantic perspectives on ultimate reality, kind of non-dual perspectives. And then even some of the channeled material we have, some of what I would consider some of the best channeled material from the others, often depicts a very, very similar notion about reality. I was saying this to you before we went on the air, that I've been reading some channeled material recently with a group that people would sort of perceive as the Zetas. I think it's more complex than just being an extraterrestrial species from Zeta Reticuli, but that's one way we can think about it. It's one way that looks, right, from a certain perspective. As I've said many times, I think these notions like interdimensional, extraterrestrial, extra-tempestrial, they'll all kind of collapse once we have a more robust understanding of reality itself. But what's very interesting is that these channeled materials reflect a kind of reality that these others depict, which very much fits, with this notion of idealism and Neo-Vedantic non-dual perspectives on reality. So it's interesting because in Buddhism, a couple of things come to mind. I was saying to you before we went on the air that I was speaking to someone today who's had remarkable anomalous experiences their entire lives. And they have actually been able to go to a place kind of at will. And basically it's a place that feels kind of like a void. There's nothing there on the one hand. There's no light, but at the same time you can still see, which again kind of plays with our understanding of what does that mean exactly. But again, try to think of this physical reality as a derivative of some deeper structure, right? So in this place, we'll say, he can see, even though it looks like there's no light and it seems empty, and yet it's full, he senses, with the potential of everything, right? So what's interesting about that is that he has no background in Buddhism or Vedantic thought, but this is very, very similar to the kind of void that's described in those traditions. And then in the deepest, sort of most progressive versions of those traditions, they recognize that ultimately those two things are not two, non-duality, right? We're back at non-duality again, that both, this is nothingness, the void, but also the potential for everything is there. And also when he goes there, he kind of has this direct ability to access all information across time from any sentient being that's ever existed, right? Because in time in that place does not exist, right? Time itself is also one of the derivative kind of byproducts that arise as something we think we experience in this construct, but it's not ultimately true of what underlying reality is like. So it's interesting that in Buddhism, there is this real focus on this sense that be really disciplined about understanding your mind, understand how to bring your mind under control, how to take hold of the reins of the monkey mind that wants to run 1,000 miles an hour. I've said many times on this podcast on Point of Convergence that we actually have the ability already, because we are an iteration of Source. We are leaves on the tree that is Source. We have the ability to see as far into the horizon as we need. We can actually access that kind of void that where the potential of everything is there, and it's also a kind of nothingness, because it's pre-form, right? There's no form yet, but it has the potential energy of everything, basically. But what's interesting is in Buddhism, they will really get you to focus on being very disciplined about what your mind does, right? Clear your mind. And as you clear your mind, these other broader aspects of reality begin to rise up into your awareness, because you're finally not being blocked by these things that are just coming up. I got to get the groceries tomorrow. I got to talk to this person. Why did that person look at me that way yesterday? What did that mean? You know, like all these things that fill our mind. Once we're able to quiet the mind, then this deeper reality exposes itself, and it was always there. In the same way that, you know, there's that notion we talked about before, everyone is the Buddha in potential, right? So along those lines, getting to the tulpa thing, there's also been this notion in Tibetan Buddhism that you can actually produce a tulpa. This sense that you can, through thought, create an entity that takes on kind of a life of its own. And what's very interesting about that is that, again, that kind of fits with this consciousness first perspective on reality, fits with idealism, and even, you know, the Theosophical Society in the 20th century and whatnot actually took that notion, began to actually produce experiments trying to sort of mirroring modern science with this ancient sort of Tibetan Buddhist practice around tulpas, to actually see if they could indeed produce an entity that kind of takes on a life of its own in a measurable way, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, that void conversation reminds me in seminary of in the Hebrew Bible. I know you'll be familiar with this, that the moment of creation, the Spirit of God sort of hovers over the ocean, over the waters. And, you know, obviously it's quite metaphorical in nature, but the Hebrew is formless and void. So there's this intense potentiality to it that at the inception of all that there is. So these are concepts that are ingrained and, you know, I think quite familiar to most people, even if they haven't necessarily heard them directly. We also talk about this in our science. Let's not forget things like the Big Bang or singularities, you know, black holes, which have all of the information that they retain all the information that they absorb, essentially, but they are also kind of nothingness in our minds, a void, if you will. So these are conceptions that exist in many different areas, and when you see that happen, that's a signal, I think, that there is some truth to it. When you see this take shape in a variety of different manifestations, there is an underlying truth to that. The tulpa conversation also made me think about our own conceptions of who we are. So it's not just that I can think of an entity and that entity has a life of its own, but that's essentially what I'm doing with my notion of self, right? I'm thinking of a Nathan, and that Nathan exists, you know, in its own way that is independent of your version of Nathan. You know, so, you know, we are doing this all the time. It's just that it's so familiar to us. We can't even see it. We're kind of blind to the fact that we're all participating in this process, and we're all doing it actively all the time. And it just seems very mundane. When you kind of step back and look at it from a different angle, you realize how amazing it actually is, and how it points to this deeper layer of reality that, for whatever reason, we don't tend to think about very often.
Yeah, I love that. It's a great point. And like you say, not only is your conception of yourself different than my conception of you, right, to some degree. And a spiritual teacher of mine, Thomas Ubel, always taught me to make sure that I'm not referring to a cache. I'm C-A-C-H-E, right? This version of Nathan that's in my mind, in my memory, that is actually not indicative of who's in front of me right now. Even though he's on a screen and, you know, 2 hours away, nevertheless, the energy of the person who's manifesting right now, am I present to that? Or am I kind of lazily referencing, oh yeah, I know Nathan. I mean, I've known him for a while now, and this is the way he is. So I'm sort of hearing the words he's saying, but I know what he talks about. So, you know, I don't need to like pay too much attention. But when we do that in our relationships, we actually are not in real time being with the energy as it's manifesting now, right? So we do get very lazy about it. And to that point, not only is my conception different than your conception of yourself, especially if I'm being lazy and not being present to the energy as it is right now, but on top of that, your own experience of yourself is different than what it was 5 years ago, right? Or 10 years ago. But it's not like you sit around fretting about that going, what do I do about this? Like what do I have? Like, is this dissociative identity disorder? What's going on? I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago. And yet that's true for all of us, especially if we are hopefully growing from the inputs, the catalysts that life presents us, right, with. Hopefully we are growing and changing, and yet we're okay with that. We just kind of go with the flow, right? So like you say, that we kind of get duped into thinking it's not happening because there's these realities we've been convinced of in our modern myth, right, with physicalism and whatnot, that convince us that's not happening. It's almost like a stage trick, right, where we actually believe that, when if we really sit down and were to take really close, pay really close attention to who we are and our belief structures and what we do, and we compare it every 5 years, we would see change, right? So there is kind of a bait and switch that happens there that we don't even pay attention to. So yeah, that's fascinating. And I think, again, it just speaks to how that's because our own modern culture has taken on a life of its own. So much so that we don't even see it for what it is. It's right in front of our eyes. We're somehow blind to it because we've taken on its very nature in many ways.
Yeah, amen to that. And, how often are you in a relationship with someone where you're not present to who they really are? You're in a relationship with someone they used to be, or someone who you have concocted. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, just from a personal interaction perspective, that we try to practice that powerful presence in all of our interactions. I know we talked about one particular notable experiment that kind of toys with this idea, and I think it'd be good to spend some time sharing that with our listeners. So there was a Canadian group, I guess were they a theosophical group, who were participating in a thought experiment where they were coming up with an entity named Philip, which I just love. It's just, here's our friend Philip, who we just made up. Not a very creative name in my opinion, but it's fine. So Philip was someone that these individuals kind of pooled together their intention to manifest, and lo and behold, over time, they were getting feedback in their group sessions from Philip. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that experiment and kind of what does it tell us about what's happening with these kinds of collective shared mentation processes.
Rank. I love that word, mentation processes. Way to go. 10 points right there. Okay, so let's give a bit of background here. I'm going to read the description of this experiment that was done by this group in Toronto, and this is from Wikipedia. So I'm quoting here. The experiment was conducted by a Toronto Parapsychological Research Society, led by mathematical geneticist Dr. A.R. George Owen, and overseen by psychologist Dr. Joel Witten. The test group consisted of Owen's wife, Iris Owen, former chairperson of Mensa in Canada, Margaret Sparrow, industrial designer Andy H., his wife Lauren, heating engineer Al Peacock, accountant Bernice M., bookkeeper Dorothy O'Donnell, and sociology student Sidney Kay. Their goals were to create a fictional character through a purposeful methodology and then attempt to communicate with it through seance. The character created and agreed upon was named Philip Aylesford, referred to as Philip during the test. His multiple contradictions and errors, his fictional history partially coincided with actual events and places, but with multiple contradictions and errors. He was born in 1624 in England, had an early military career, and was knighted by the age of 16. He was involved in the English Civil War and became personal friends with Charles II, working for him as a spy. Philip was unhappily married to a woman named Dorothea and later fell in love with a Romani girl who was accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. In despair, Philip committed suicide in 1654 at the age of 30. Unquote. So that is basically the fictional history of a person that, just to make clear to people, this person never existed, quote unquote, right? But they basically put together a biography of this person, began to build up a sense of them knowing this person, right? They take on a life of their own, and they then set up experiments to see if they could actually begin to get responses independent of any of them that would suggest that this character had taken on a life of their own in physical reality. So just jumping to this next section here from the Wikipedia article in terms of what happened. Quote, the group was seated around a table with initial seances yielding no contact, no communication, and no phenomenon. Owen changed test conditions by dimming lights and changing the environment to mimic that of a more traditional seance. Participants began feeling a presence, table vibrations, breezes, unexplained echoes, and rapping sounds, which matched responses to questions about Philip's life. At one point, the table tilted on a single leg and at other times moved across the room without human contact. Although audio, video, and witness accounts document the paranormal phenomena, Philip never appeared to the participants, unquote. So that's basically some of the physical phenomena that seemed to manifest, which spoke to the notion that this attempt was somewhat successful, right? That they had focused in a shared intention kind of way around creating this character to the point where they basically believed themselves that this person was real, and then they could, almost like a Frankensteinian kind of, experiment, bring forth life, and then actually be able to interact in the seance with this character.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And my boys and even myself, I'm a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons. So this is if you've ever participated in the Dungeons and Dragons campaign, you're creating your own character. They've got a backstory usually. And you're interacting with characters in the story who are also created from the mind of the dungeon master, or even perhaps from the group that you're participating with. And I went through a campaign not too long ago with some friends where we had a non-playable character, just a random character in the story. It was like a shopkeeper or whatever, and he ended up taking on a life of his own and becoming one member of our party. And so he developed a personality. He had all these kind of qualities that just formed from our mutual interaction. Obviously, that is not the same thing necessarily that we're talking about here, but it is a proxy to that. It's an illustration of how when minds work collectively around a particular idea or notion or character or entity, that does kind of give birth to additional qualities, character traits, abilities that did not exist before. And we could say, oh, well, that's just because, the human imagination is really powerful, man. I mean, that's just what's happening there. But I think we find that even if that is true, that it absolutely has an effect on what we call the world and reality around us, right? That it absolutely does change the way we behave, not only in our own personal lives, but interpersonally. It changes the way we think. It changes the way we interact, not just interpersonally, but from like a corporate interaction and a personal interaction, or organizationally, how organizations interact with one another. I mean, all of us who've worked kind of a corporate job understand that there's this corporate persona that in a way like is unfazed by whether or not like you're there or not. So if you leave tomorrow, well, the corporation shoulders on, and it doesn't need you necessarily, and it's going to continue behaving in a certain way that you would expect it to behave. And if it doesn't, well, then what happens there? That causes all kinds of chaos in terms of the shareholders get freaked out, and this isn't the company I invested in, and it creates all this sort of chaos around it. So all examples of things that I think we can point to say that this is a very real phenomenon that happens, and it's very powerful. But it's so part of our everyday life that to us it's not something we really spend a lot of time thinking about, and seems very subtle, but in fact is quite dynamic.
Indeed. I mean, I think people often hear these notions, and as you were just pointing to there, they tend to think about these far out kind of occultist notions and whatnot, and theosophical kind of experiments. But just to clarify, in this kind of experiment we just described with the Philip experiment in Toronto, they really were trying to measure this in a way that they could demonstrate that this was manifesting in what, again, we perceive as physical reality, which almost anyone, again, brought up in a physicalist kind of culture is going to say, well, that is demonstrably significant, right? Because this is clearly not just hallucination or even mass hallucination, because if you can record these things happening so that someone not even involved with the experiment can after the fact see it and listen to it and hear it and see these physical manifestations, then somehow it is actually interacting. Now, what's interesting, of course, is this should not surprise us, because everything we've been saying on this podcast about consciousness being primary suggests that physical reality, again, as we perceive it, is a derivative of movements in consciousness, right? So that being the case, we should see things like this. And so I would suggest these kinds of experiments are actually further evidence pointing in this direction, this kind of idealistic kind of perspective on reality. And there's other ones like this, where sometimes they've found these kind of poltergeist phenomena, right? So we can talk about this for a little bit, because not only has poltergeist phenomena been associated with the UFO phenomenon and general paranormality, but on top of that, there's been times where, even apart from that, there's been cases where different hauntologists, H-A-U-N-T, will go and actually work with people who have had situations where poltergeist phenomena have been arising in a home. And very often they find this relates back to a teenage girl, because there's something about that alchemical process of when a girl is moving towards a woman, and all of the chaotic energies that are involved in that process are so intense that it can actually sort of boil over that barrier, right? And actually manifest in physical reality. So very often, once they age out of that process, the phenomena dissipates, right? Very, very interesting. And in the same way, these others, some of them that seem to intersect with our reality, like a parallel reality that intersects with our own, produces after the fact poltergeist phenomena, right? And so some people go, why is that? Like, what is that? What do poltergeists have to do with like a UFO? But it's the same kind of notion, perhaps, where there's so much energy poured into a situation that the excess can produce byproducts in what we perceive as space-time, days, weeks, months later. We think about Skinwalker Ranch, right, and how people have this boilover effect with hitchhiker phenomena, where people just socially connected to someone can have some of this boil over, which again speaks to the fact that the traffic happens on a consciousness level, not in the physical construct, right? And which again, I think points towards this notion that the physical construct is a byproduct, a derivative aspect of some deeper movement in consciousness. And I think where we sometimes go wrong in trying to understand the UFO phenomenon is we assume physical reality is a thing, right? We assume this is like well-proven, demonstrable, that we don't have to question. So how is it that they're manipulating our physical reality, which we know is a thing and solid and trustworthy? That confuses us. But what I think we see evidence of is that they are working in the substrate below physical construct, or what, is overarchingly surrounding that construct. And they do it directly from that deeper structure, through which we only ever see the byproduct of what that looks like in this derivative aspect of space-time. And until we begin to think about it in those terms, I think we're going to really wrestle with trying to understand what's going on. And as I pointed out on previous episodes on this podcast, I spoke about this in New York, what's interesting is there are other studies being done in parallel kind of fields of inquiry, right? Neuroscience and quantum physics, that are pointing in the same direction. This notion that space-time cannot be fundamental. There must be a deeper structure, because basically space-time is telling on itself. There's evidence arising in the data saying this cannot be fundamental. It looks more like a derivative product of something deeper. And we've already begun to, I've talked about people like Nima Arkani-Hamed, these physicists who are basically now coming up with mathematical conceptions of what this deeper structure might look like, which is very interesting, because sometimes in our science, we can conceive of these things mathematically before we can necessarily demonstrate them. Sometimes, like Einstein, right, will come up with a notion mathematically, and then, sure enough, 30, 40 years later, we actually are finally able to show evidence, right, empirical evidence saying that was true. Well, we're now at that point with space-time, where we recognize mathematically there must be something deeper. And that's why we're really on the frontier of a new science where we can begin to reckon with what the UFO phenomenon is, what poltergeist phenomena are. What is this tulpa kind of notion, right, or an egregore, which is when numerous people get together to produce something. So in some ways, the Toronto experiment was more of an egregore than a tulpa. But in either way, we're talking about consciousness joining together to basically make something out of nothing that takes on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm. And you hear sort of classically, there are two ways of looking at the phenomena. And I want to tease these out a little bit here. So one is that when you hit that place where you're like, well, how are they doing this? And there's a lot of people that go, it's a technology. They have a technology that we just don't have, and they're using some fancy gizmo to change the way that we look, that we perceive reality, whatever. And that's a very physicalist, materialist way of looking at how it would work. And then there's this other way of looking at it that you've been talking about, where consciousness is the fundamental component. And I wonder how, in your own life, I think we could talk about this quite a bit, but I want to touch on this both on an individual level, but at a collective level as well. How shifting your perspective to the idealist viewpoint, to consciousness being at this root level, how that does in fact change the way that you look at interactions that you have with other people. It changes the way that you relate to information and knowledge. It colors every facet of your lived experience. I can, from my own personal experience, can attest that looking at the world in this way, it changes the way that you interact with people that you're close to. It changes the way that you look at information, that you've learned things. You're tapping into a different conception of reality than just the sort of textbook. I literally pick up a textbook and I'm learning a fact, or reading something on the internet, and I'm absorbing it that way, or I'm testing it in a lab, and therefore it is real. It's not that you can't continue to do those things, but you kind of feel into a deeper layer of connectedness. And even just as recently as a few days ago, I had one of these moments with somebody on Twitter where I just kind of reached out to this person and shared an experience that I had, and it kind of led to like a cascade of synchronicity, just in a matter of a few minutes of this exchange. I don't know this person; they don't know me. We have no like shared history, but this one sort of connecting point, basically, like a flower, kind of bloomed into all these other connecting points. And I would argue that that's probably true for everything, because everything is connected in that way. It's very fractally connected, and so it's almost like a spider web, right? If you pluck one of the little threads on that web, well, it activates the entire thing. It's all very, very, very much connected. Yet that one sort of section of the web is fractally representative of the whole. So there would be this kind of similarity or repeating sort of knowledge at work there that would present itself to us as these sort of synchronicities or powerful insights, because we have access to it at that little level, and then we can kind of unfold it to the larger level as well.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, because if you think about it, to use an analogy, imagine you kind of have this is kind of a crude analogy, but this occurred to me as you were talking. Imagine you have a paint gun, and the paint gun is indicative of this deeper structure, and you fire, some paint out of this paint gun, and imagine like this sort of splash of paint kind of coming out of this gun, right? This mechanism, and it flies across the room, and on the other side of the room, you have kind of this long sheet of paper that's being fed through a mechanism that's running it horizontally, right? So it's running from one side of the room to the other. And so the paint's going to splash on the paper, but it's going to land at different points of the paper, because the paper is also kind of running laterally, right, as the paint is coming. Am I painting the picture adequately?
Yeah, I like it. I want to do this now.
Right. We're going to experiment. But then think about space-time as our experience of the paper, right? So we look at the paper and we go, wow, look at these synchronicities. Like, it's splashed here, and then 3 seconds later it's here, and then 5 seconds later it's here. But actually, it's this interaction of this deeper process, and we're kind of blind to the elements that produce the final result. And we assume that the paper is all there is, and so we assume it must be something there. And so we see things that look like anomalous, right? We talk about these like synchronicities being meaningful coincidences, and you and I talked about before we went on the air, that even sometimes if someone who's really baked into the physicalist mindset and bought into that propaganda, 100%, even when you describe the most bizarre orchestration of synchronicities, they'll say, wow, that's some weird coincidences, man. Well, I guess in an infinite universe, anything can happen, right? So they'll say that kind of thing, right? Not realizing how preposterous that sounds, like that's far less likely than something spookier than that is going on, right? And so it just shows you how, again, these things take on a life of their own, and people almost are not even able to objectively really look honestly at what's happening. But this is what I find fascinating, because when I look at my own life over the last 3 months, much of which you've been privy to, there's been just this bizarre level of synchronistic orchestration where I almost feel like I'm standing still and reality is moving around me, right? So it's not that I'm moving in the world and things are happening, but I feel more like as I step into a flow and participate with this sense of what I'm supposed to be doing, then suddenly the world is moving around me is kind of what it feels like. And then we can, after the fact, interpret it as this series of synchronicities, but it's really about this deeper structure, and then looking at the byproduct that's created the same way that you can look at this long sheet of paper and trying to make sense of these paint dots on it as a pattern, not recognizing that interactive process that was involved there. So this, I think, again, is all pointing to us being in this really virgin territory where we're seeing all this evidence, right, pointing in this direction, not only from the UFO phenomenon, not just from poltergeist phenomena or general paranormality, not just from tulpas and egregores that we talked about from the Toronto experiment and things like that, but also in near-death experiences, right, in out-of-body experiences where people, well, there's this one woman, I'm forgetting her name at the top of my head, but she's going to be part of the next Anomalous conference in New York. She wrote a book called Changed in a Flash, where she was struck by lightning and walking into a synagogue in Houston, I think. And next thing she knew, she was in a place that she perceived as kind of heaven, talking to this kind of grandfatherly kind of figure, came back, was resuscitated because turns out there was numerous heart doctors in the synagogue, so they were able to bring her back. But then once she was back, she proceeded to have precognitive dreams about the future, like disasters and whatnot that were happening. She would dream about this. This wasn't part of her reality beforehand, right? So this is so fascinating because, again, not only does that violate our understanding of space-time, we're not supposed to know things ahead of time, right? That's not supposed to be possible. And the fact that the fact that it does happen to her and to many people, and it's demonstrable in the evidence, in the data, is already telling us that space-time can't be what we think it is. It must be more like a secondary byproduct of something deeper. But what was it about her experience in a near-death experience that somehow opened up her capacity to have these kind of precognitive dreams, right? Because as we talked about before with the free survey that was done a few years ago, in any of these contact modalities, if you've experienced one, you're much more likely to experience the others after that, because it's almost like a switch gets flipped, right? And we talked before about, again, Donald Hoffman's work around really our usual default mode experience of reality in our waking state is kind of this derivative process that's more like icons on a desktop, right? So I'm not seeing Nathan as he really is. I'm seeing an icon that evolution has served up to me so I can move through the world and stay alive basically enough to like propagate the species. And that's it, right? Which means all sorts of reality is being blocked out, filtered out. And what some of these experiences allow us to do is to break outside of that, whether it's something like a psychedelic journey or something like contact with non-human intelligence or a near-death experience, right? All of these things can somehow open up the aperture, and suddenly we're experiencing not just more reality, but we seem to have more of an interaction now with the substructure which produces physical reality. That's what I think this is pointing to, and I think it's just fascinating.
Well, do you want to experience more reality? Sure, we all do. That then leads to, I think, the next sort of area of conversation, which is the practical application of this way of thinking, both for the individual and communities, right? So if we were to begin implementing this way of thinking in a community, or if the world even adopted this metaphysical perspective, how does that change the entire equation And I'm sure just like anything, it brings some positive changes and also some very, sort of destabilizing changes. It's not like it's going to be all Shangri-La. But I think it might be good to talk through, some of the implications here of this way of thinking, and also address some of the critiques that you often hear from outsiders who might look into certain groups within the community who have tried to practice this or put it into practice. Here I'm thinking of like heist groups or C5 groups, or Mission Rama, a good example with the heist. People who look at that from the outside and say, well, that looks kind of, kooky and culty to me. It looks very, religious, and anything that looks like religion, well, that's not what we do anymore in modernity. So I'm going to run away from that. I'm going to make sure everybody knows not to go close to it because it's just very, very dangerous. So I wonder what you think about that. And is there a way we can put this into practice and avoid some of the pitfalls that maybe that kind of religiosity has fallen prey to in the past?
Yeah, it's fascinating when you think about C5 or HICE, human-initiated contact events, as is what it stands for. Because as people like Jacques Vallée have talked about, it is very much like a new religion in some ways, right? Now, as our friend James Iandoli often has to deal with, is people who say that we're basically summoning something, right?
Okay.
And so he'll make the point that, and many practitioners of C5 and HICE will point out that it's more of an interactive, participatory kind of communication or relationship, right, rather than a summoning. But some people who, again, are more coming from an occultist or religious background will say, sure looks like summoning to me, right? And there's even this group of guys in Southern California literally called the Orb Summoners, right?
Right.
And they've actually been able to do this, right? I remember them being interviewed by George Knapp, and they talked about, this is a fascinating case of how practice is paired with experience, right? Because they sensed that part of the magic formula, if you will, was that they had a really positive attitude of gratitude towards life and the fundamental forces behind life, and even these others that they were reaching out to. So as you're listening to them being interviewed by George Knapp, it's quite interesting because you see them practicing these protocols in real time, right? George will be like asking a question. So why is it that such and such and such and such? And they'll say, well, first of all, I want to thank you so much, George, for that excellent question. I appreciate the spirit that you're bringing to this conversation, and I appreciate what you've done and who you are on top of that. Like, you really are a pillar of this community, and we want to thank you for that. We have so much gratitude for you. And then they go and answer the question, right? But that is part of the protocol, right? Is that they believe that by building up that kind of etheric kind of energy, you're actually priming the pump that produces the physical phenomena to some degree, right? So that's a really fascinating aspect of it. And now I'm completely supportive of CE5 and HICE, because I do believe that some of these others are very benevolent and are willing and ready to reach out to us, especially when we take the front foot, right? I think that some of these more benevolent ones really honor our free will, and so they won't intrude in our lives in the same way that some of the other groups that maybe are not quite so benevolent do. So there is a sense that if you come with the right attitude, right, and you, it's funny when you think about it, because here we're back in kind of religious language. If you will humble yourself before the Lord, right?
Right.
In this way, it's coming, if you will humble yourself, and in some cases with the Mission Rama and whatnot, and become a vegetarian, and meditate, right, and come together and make sure that everyone you invite is at a certain level of consciousness, then we will show up. And if some of those things are not met, we might not show up, right? Now, some people might say, well, that's just the others being finicky, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you could say, maybe not. Maybe this is some sort of dynamic alchemical process that happens when you energize a process, that something happens, right? I think, again, back to my experience at the Monroe Institute last year, where we came together, not only trying different psi phenomena, telepathy and remote viewing and that kind of thing, but also, joining together to invite benevolent entities to show up And then sure enough, we actually had experiences and we were able to capture on film, again, in physical consensus reality, right? Things in the sky that did not seem to be prosaic, right? And we even submitted to MUFON, and they concluded the same thing, that it wasn't something prosaic, right? It was officially designated as anomalous, right? So, but what's also interesting is that just our shared consensus, cohesive flow together, a coherent field that we created together, also seemed to be demonstrably impacting the random number generator that was on the side of the mountain, right? So again, you have time and time again, you can see this evidence where intention alone, mental intention, mentation processes actually seem to show up in physical reality, which I again think points to, again, the fundamental nature of consciousness, and that we're just at the beginning of understanding this, and that, again, what some of these others represent is brothers and sisters in the cosmic chain who are further along in that process and therefore have a much more robust ability to interact with reality in ways that look to us like magic, right? We're back to that notion that, a sufficiently sophisticated technology is going to look like magic to a lesser civilization. But it's more than that, I think. It's actually not just external technology, but it's technology happening internally or at the level of consciousness, right? The bedrock that precedes the physical reality. And that's still a kind of technology, but it's kind of an inner science, as my former teacher, Thomas Ubel, would call it, right? He really tried to develop this really robust and well-developed sense of what does inner science look like? How can we turn inward and find as much possibility there as we do in looking outward towards the stars?
Well, I'm about to make a reference to something you probably never heard on Liminal Frames before, but this makes me think about football in a whole different perspective, right? So think about the NFL football teams. They're gathering in the locker room before the game. If you've been to a high school football game, there's a lot of this happening too. There's a big huddle, there's a pep talk, there's a lot of language in sports. I'm just kind of picking on football here. But that is designed around this, visualization, that's designed around thinking as a team, visualizing the outcome that you want. You want the win. Also, there's that gratitude at work as well. The way in which, at least in U.S. Sports and football in particular, I think very often there's this, kind of like praying after you get the touchdown, or, thanking God for your amazing catch or whatever. It's like, well, does God have like money on this game? Like, what is going on here? To those of us who've studied religion, it always sounds very strange, but, it is perhaps, I'm arguing here, like another kind of manifestation of this concept that there is something at work here when minds align and kind of entrain themselves in a certain way that produces outcomes that would not have happened otherwise. And think about how powerful that is. I mean, you could argue that we do it just because it feels good. We're doing these things just because it's a ritual and it feels good, and maybe there's some superstition to it. I always say this kind of prayer and do this kind of thing before I, throw the football or whatever. But on the other hand, you could say that there's something much more to it than that. That these are just, kind of manifestations of a deeper process at work. And again, what we touched on earlier in this episode, how it's happening everywhere, all around us, all the time. Whether you're on the sports field or you're in the boardroom, you're participating in this kind of activity. And it's tangible. You can literally feel whether or not you are doing this as a group or you are not doing it. And people will leave that room or leave that experience and tell an individual person who would be interviewing them, I felt like we were totally not on the same page. Everybody was, all over the place, and as a result, it's just complete chaos. And I don't feel like we're going to be able to execute on our vision or whatever it is. There's something to the need for us to communicate and kind of merge our minds together into a greater mind, so that we can actually achieve things. And maybe that is one of our greatest skills, is to do this, and it might also be why we see it, like why we see our species able to achieve so much, right? Because we are in the chain of kind of conscious beings, higher up in the chain, and so there is sort of a greater efficacy to that collective pooling of will than if you had it happening at a lower down the chain of conscious entity. Sorry, I'm just kind of riffing here on these concepts, but it's definitely something to think about.
I love it, and I've got a story to share on that. But first of all, I want to say I'm pretty sure Nathan uses the word efficacy as much as I use discombobulating. I think it would not be a Little Frames episode without at least one mention of that word.
It just sounds good.
But I was thinking about this experience I had that felt almost like being thrust into someone's like religious experience or the religious tradition. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and one time a friend of mine who attended Ole Miss University, right? This was when I was living in Texas at one point. We drove to Alabama to see a game between Ole Miss and Alabama, right? So I had not been exposed to deep South football games, right? But man alive, that was like a religious experience, right? You go in, everybody's like wearing the colors, right? And you hear Bama, 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 like everywhere, right? It's like I was at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem or something. You know what I mean? Like the degree of like religious fervor. And I could see it, like it's almost like people didn't realize how much they'd entered this completely different mental zone where it was completely, equivalent of like a religious kind of tradition. And it's funny because we think about America today and many people want to rush home to church. Why? Because they want to watch the football game, right? So it's like we're slowly trading one religious tradition for another, right? And to your point, we do seem to do this, right? This is just what we do. So perhaps it behooves us to, give some forethought to what kind of things we want to give life to, because as I said, at first we generate them and then they generate us. It's kind of like that saying about habits, we form our habits and then our habits form us, right? So we really want to give some forethought to this because the things we give life to will very much dictate our ongoing existence from then on. So when we think about the challenges, the problems in the world, I think we need to have all that in mind before we sort of more methodically really give some forethought to what we might give life to.
Mm-hmm. Well, and here, let me just throw another curveball in this conversation, because it's not only the things which we choose to devote our energy to and thoughts to, but let us not forget there are other intelligences at work, and they too have kind of thought forms and energetic tendencies, and they're not all aligned, right? So just as you talked about earlier, some of them operate in a place where they have a greater mastery over what we know as reality because of their presence to or connectivity to that base layer in a way that we're just not as adept at using. They have their own agendas and have their own influence, and those agendas and influence intersect with our experience, the human experience. And to what degree could we chart some of those influences in humanity over time? And, where we might be going, where we may have come from, what, kind of ear we're listening to, what kind of influence we're listening to there or not, right? Because I think we are at a pivotal point in our history, at least it feels that way, where we've got this tremendous lure of technology that is not necessarily a mental thing. It's something that we have created that stands apart from our mentation, and it often kind of completely absorbs us on an individual level and almost hypnotizes us, you could say. And then we have other practices that are much more ancient that don't involve staring at a screen or an app or whatever, playing a game all day long.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that you bring this up. And this feels like a bizarre synchronicity right here, because as you were talking, I was going to help segue us into bringing this full circle. And we began talking about religious kind of rites and rituals and how that is married with belief and practice and forms or informs the identity of a group, right? But there's been this recognition from people like Jacques Vallée that we are seeing ufology in some ways become that, like a new kind of religion, right? And he really thought in the 70s that this was going to be the next fad, was that this belief in these space brothers and whatnot was going to give birth to this new kind of religion. And we can get to that. But before I was going to get there, I was reading this quote that I wrote down, and I was trying to remember the source for this quote. I was like, was this Wikipedia? Was this an article? And then as you said AI, I'm like, oh yeah, I just punched in Jacques Vallée into ChatGPT and punched out this 3-paragraph summary of his work, right, pertaining to the UFO phenomenon and religion. Well, I think I asked one question and got this, really robust, pretty detailed explanation. And there was no source other than this AI, right, which we generated, and now it's generating back, right? So with all the real complexities that presents us with. But let me just read this AI-generated notion here, and then we can jump into this. So Jacques Vallée is a French-born computer scientist, venture capitalist, and ufologist who has written extensively about the UFO phenomenon. He is known for his skeptical and interdisciplinary approach to the study of UFOs and has made a number of observations about the potential links between UFOs and religion. Vallée has argued that the UFO phenomenon shares many characteristics with traditional religious experiences. He has noted that both involve encounters with beings or entities that are seen as powerful, mysterious, and often beyond human comprehension. Vallée has also suggested that the UFO phenomenon has the potential to reshape our understanding of religion and spirituality by challenging traditional religious beliefs and offering new ways of thinking about the nature of the universe and our place in it. At the same time, Vallée has been critical of what he sees as the uncritical acceptance of UFO sightings and encounters by some members of the UFO community. He has argued that many of these sightings can be explained by natural or man-made phenomena, and that the focus on physical evidence in sightings can obscure the deeper psychological and cultural factors that contribute to the UFO phenomenon. Overall, Vallée's work on UFOs and religion highlights the complex and multifaceted nature of the UFO phenomenon and suggests that it is worthy of serious study and analysis by scholars and researchers from a wide range of disciplines. Unquote ChatGPT. Thank you for AI, non-human intelligence, giving us that answer. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Jacques, of course, I'm a big fan of his work, and he's been highly influential on me in how I approach this subject. But also, Jacques is a technologist, right? He's somebody who is very much in the technology camp, but has tried his best to interpret all of these anomalous experiences through a lens that at least I think he's making the attempt to put forward a new kind of science, a new way of studying this, that the traditional means and methodologies of science or categories of science just don't quite work. I think he's right to, or at least ChatGPT's characterization of him, right, and to be wary a little bit of, kind of the religious qualities of ufology. But personally, the term religion is off-putting to me, because I think we have it's become a pejorative and a crutch as well, and it obscures the fact that that belief is something that we all actually share, we all have in common. So just because I can kind of categorize and list out a series of beliefs and say, hey, there's a religion and I'm not doing that, it makes us feel very comfortable, because we have placed religion in this taboo sort of category, even though ignoring the fact that I'm supposed to do these things at work, I'm supposed to answer my email, and I'm supposed to praise the almighty dollar and invest in my 401k, and these are things that are going to make my life better, and if I don't do them, then I'm going to have you can see where I'm going with this. They're religious practices in their own way. Just because we have kind of labeled them or characterized them as something other than religion, they are more socially acceptable, palatable. And I think that's just doing a disservice to belief, period, right? We all have beliefs. We all have narrative structures that inform the way in which we live. Let's just look at it from that perspective, and kind of eschew this religion label that I think is holding back the conversation. When it comes to ufology in particular, I do think that the anomalous experiences that we hear about should and do inform our metaphysical conceptions of reality. And what we've been arguing on this show time and time again is that needs to happen. If you aren't observing these experiences or going through them yourself and coming away with a sense that, the narrative framework that I had before, isn't broken. If you're just thinking everything's fine, I got to keep, bowing at the feet of the scientific method, for example, at the exclusion of maybe new models of reality that might have a better explanatory power, you're missing the point, right? And so this is how reality does work. The sort of path of time, the trajectory of time. We see this in history, so this isn't anything new. That reality is confrontational to our conceptions of it, and it will always be so. So I don't know if I got to say that again, but reality is going to challenge what we think is really happening, and it's doing that in ways that are interruptive, that interject in our lived experience. And instead of us just saying, well, that was a coincidence, or that was very strange, or that can't possibly happen, so I invented this out of whole cloth, then maybe for the first time we need to say, well, geez, my model just isn't working. It's not working. It's not fitting all of the things that are really taking place in reality, in experience, in the human experience. So, I'm a proponent, as I know you are, of trying to chart a new path forward here. And with this particular, sort of mentation process and collective mentation, I would argue that we need to begin thinking in that way. That the more of us who think in that way and adopt this kind of broader framework, then the more comfortable we will be with the way things actually are, right? We'll be less discomfited by the anomalous because the anomalous is now a part of the model.
Indeed. What we're saying is that all these things we now count as anomalous are ultimately just reality, just aspects of reality we don't have icons for so far in our interface. A couple of thoughts occurred to me, and I was thinking we could, finish with a couple of quotes by Valet on the intersection between UFOs and religion, which is been a central topic for us on this show because of our background, right? Having deep histories, both of us, in those two fields. But I think about what we were saying with AI, and I think as much as we recognize now that there's this real threat that AI poses on a couple of different levels, right? On the one hand, because there's this concern that it could go rogue, and because it's coming up with solutions now that even the people with a deep interest, deep insiders understanding how the models are supposed to work, how the deep learning is supposed to happen, don't really understand how it's achieving the answers it's coming to, which, kind of brings to mind, Terminator kind of memories of something that at some point just takes over, right? But also another reason why it's problematic is that our own biases are programmed into it. So when we think about this generative process of we generate something that then generates something back to us, we can only give birth to a kind of AI at our level of consciousness, and we're going to seed it with all of our biases. So that is concerning because it's maybe insanely powerful, but also having the inherent limitations of our own biases. And so what is that going to produce? It could be a Frankensteinian kind of thing again, right? So this is something to think about. I think as much as everyone rails against AI, if we had a sufficient level of consciousness, of a center of gravity on the planet, where we focused on the greatest good, then AI could be an incredibly powerful tool that could help us conquer and tackle, climate change and discrepancies in resource distribution across the planet. It could help us come up with solutions that we hadn't even considered yet, right? But as long as we instead are divisive and convinced of this illusion of separation, then we're going to have bad actors who get access to these models who are going to just game the system and figure out how to become rich at everybody else's cost, right? So you've got these zero-sum game players playing with AI. And so it's going to give you back a solution based on your level of consciousness, which is what is kind of scary about it. But again, I just want to underline that the real problem there is the lack of consciousness, not AI in itself, right? But a couple of thoughts, or a couple of quotes I'd like to bring up here as we sort of come to a close here. Let's riff on this. So I'll say this to you, and then you can have the first go at it. So Valet said, the symbolic display seen by the abductees is identical to the type of initiation ritual or astral voyage that is embedded in the occult traditions of every culture. The structure of abduction stories is identical to that of occult initiation rituals. The UFO beings of today belong to the same class of manifestation as the occult entities that were described in centuries past. Unquote. Over to you.
Right. So it's all occult, man. That's what no, it's not what I'm going to go with that. It's demons. No, I mean, I think that's where he's going with that. I hope, and that people often take it where I just took it, that it must be that. But, here we have something that has taken place throughout history that is part of the human experience. And the things which we know about in our history that look like religious tradition all got their start from these same experiences. And they are profound and dynamic, and they impact our civilization. I mean, geez, look at the way these traditions have impacted our entire world and still do right now. I mean, we're fighting wars to this day over differences of belief that have stemmed from these initiative anomalous experiences. And so that should give us pause, right? Some might say, well, see, like, that's the bad, these are bad entities because they're kind of creating these different religions and now we're fighting with each other. I mean, maybe, but I think it's more of an interpretive problem. We've interpreted these experiences really poorly, just like children who are excellent listeners but poor interpreters. That's exactly what we are. We've been confronted with these very strange things, and we've run off with our interpretations that, of course, mirror the kinds of worldviews that we had when we experienced them. So whether you're Chris Bledsoe and you kind of overlay, a much more kind of Christian sort of fabric onto the experience, or you're Paul from the Bible, who has his Damascus Road experience, and he comes from a Jewish tradition, and so this is he's starting churches, and he's thinking that this is an extension of that Jewish tradition and worldview. It's a natural thing to do, right? But I think it may be missing the underlying point.
Right, and I think Valet is sort of admonishing us, if you will, to use a religious term, or exhorting to be aware of, to look deeper than the superficial layer, right? So he's talking about when you get past some of the veneer of like being a technological kind of thing, the UFO phenomenon, underlyingly you seem to have events that mirror initiation rituals from, occultic traditions, or from astral voyage, even Theosophical Society kind of notions. And so it may just be that these others perhaps are changing the surface veneer, changing the nature of the ritual, but the underlying process is still the same, right? The underlying mechanism is that it somehow generates belief, which is in itself generative. And this can be part of the control system that Valet has talked about, that these rituals evolve over time as we evolve to help steer our civilization, perhaps, right? And I think about like little kids who one day they see Dad, and then they see Santa Claus, and then they see Sasquatch. And maybe it's all Dad just wearing different costumes. And he is not to get caught up on studying Sasquatch or studying Santa Claus, but why is it that Dad dresses up in these different things? What kind of ritual is he trying to produce here, right? That's kind of the goal. So let's go into one final quote, and we'll both riff on that. And it, again, draws together UFOs and religion. Valet said, quote, "I think the stage is set for the appearance of new faiths centered on the UFO belief. To a greater degree than all phenomena modern science is confronting, the UFO can inspire awe, the sense of the smallness of man, and an idea of the possibility of contact with the cosmic. The religions we have briefly surveyed began with the miraculous experiences of one person, but today there are thousands for whom the belief in otherworldly contact is based on intimate conviction drawn from what they regard as personal contact with UFOs and their occupants." Unquote. Over to you.
Yeah, I think it is the dawn of a new day, right? This is the, in a way, this is what I think it would look like as we mature as a species, that as we kind of cross the threshold of awareness of our place in reality itself, understanding that we are not alone, that we are not the top of that pyramid, that there's a whole lot more going on. And these experiences, the UFO experiences, merely point to that truth. And in a way, they kind of have been preparing us mentally, and they've been charting the course for us, if you will, to be prepared and ready for that ultimate revealing, that revelatory moment where all of our society on this planet kind of steps into that new reality. And I really hope that we can do that in a way that is productive and peaceful and not, catastrophic. And to do that in that way, we have to be willing to part with a lot of the notions that we have held thus far. Not only with our religious traditions that have been extremely tribalistic, but also with our, kind of myopic scientific thinking that has excluded these greater realities for a very long time and denigrated them, quite frankly.
Indeed, I think when I think about the moral of the story of this episode, it's that these kind of entities or thought forms or constructions in which reality takes place are happening anyway. It's something that is just part and parcel with being a human being in a construct, right? A physical construct. Is that part of that is that we have these overarching, shaping narrative constructs by which we give birth to, and then they determine much of how our lives will roll out. And so knowing that's the case, and how we've demonstrated time and time again in today's episode that this happens, whether it's a corporate logo around Nike, Just Do It, or Gatorade or something, these notions that take on a life of their own well after the original founders have died and moved on, right? They take on a life of their own, and they dominate our consumer habits and actually create a kind of sustaining nature, you would hope, for a society. But what we've seen actually is that, and again, in a kind of Frankensteinian way, the things we've given birth to, this kind of corporate structure, this kind of materialist structure, this consumer-oriented take, treat the earth like a commodity, right? This is what we've given birth to and what we're now living within that system, right? This is our new ritual, right? That we live out on a day-to-day basis as individuals, as people groups, as civilizations, as these things we call corporations, right? As a thing on its own kind of thing, which is taking on a strange kind of self-identity that has really, many ways, perverted our understanding of what is right. When your only notion is maximum value for the shareholder, regardless of any other value, then that's going to produce problems, right? So I think the lesson here is knowing these things will happen anyway. We will give birth to structures that then will dictate the nature of our civilization. We should give serious forethought about these things and try to act with the greatest good in mind each time.
Yeah, here. Another wonderful conversation. I appreciate your insights, and I think this is one that I know we've been wanting to touch on for a while, and one which informs, I think, the direction in which we're going. That more and more, you and I are both interested in looking for ways that we can broaden the conversation, bring others into the conversation, and through that change of thought, change the world. In any which way we can. And our listeners are very much a part of that. So we thank you for tuning in, and we hope that you feel comfortable sharing this episode or the show with your friends or colleagues, and bringing more folks into this conversation. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits, and we'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.